Interrupt your eating to introduce our speakers for the day. Our topic today, as you all know, is faith and the law. And our speakers are Michael J. Williams, who's an owner-shareholder in the Marion Williams Law Office, a private practice law firm in Fargo, Bismarck and Detroit Lakes. He earned a law degree from UND. He represented the plaintiffs in the landmark class action lawsuit that dramatically improved programs and services for children and adults with developmental disabilities. And his practice continues to focus on cases involving the rights of people with disabilities and cases involving serious injury or death. And our second speaker is Mark Friese, whose primary area is criminal law. He served in the North Dakota Army National Guard for 24 years, holding positions as platoon leader, executive officer, detachment commander, company commander, battalion staff, and other leadership positions. And he also was a Bismarck police officer for 5 years, where he was involved in field and recruit training, tactical team and bomb disposal team, and chemical test operator. Friese has trained law enforcement officers at seminars throughout the U.S. and frequently speaks for criminal justice organizations across the state. And our third speaker is Judge Ralph Erickson, who is one of two active U.S. District Court judges in North Dakota. Following the University of North Dakota School of Law, he was in private practice in West Fargo, where he served as a state district judge, county judge, and county magistrate. He currently serves as chief judge for the District of North Dakota and is a member of the State Bar Association. So our three speakers will come here and have a conversation with us. And just as an announcement, the next luncheon in January will actually be at the Avalon Center, and we'll be talking about urban development and the common good. I hope we will see you all there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Faith, and thank you for inviting us here today. Couldn't do anything about the weather, but you walk into the building, this is just gorgeous facility, and we're grateful to be here today. Integrating faith into action is difficult and a challenge, I think, for all of us. And putting it into practice in a legal arena with our jobs as lawyers is no less challenging. There's, of course, the obvious tension that's created between God's law and man's law, and each of us, we get to struggle with that on a daily basis. When Dr. Dovery called me and asked if we would come and talk, or if I would come and talk, I said I'd be happy to share my experience, but my experience, as you'll find out, is a little bit unusual. And so I asked if we could have some other folks here to talk about different experiences and how different lawyers apply faith in the workplace. And Mark Friese, who does criminal defense work, graciously agreed to come over and help. And Judge Erickson, who is one of the smartest, most entertaining people that I know, agreed to come over. Mark and I are going to try to talk very quickly because we know that Judge Erickson has plenty to say and will be much more interesting than I think the rest of us will be. When I grew up, I was a sports nut. And I always thought when I grew up I'd probably turn into a teacher and a coach. I didn't have any ambitions initially of becoming a lawyer. And then as I started to mature, I started thinking about some of the things in life that were more important to me. And one of my favorite verses is the Micah verse that we talked about earlier today, and that is, what does the Lord ask of me? And that's to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. And the idea that you could do justice appealed to me, and that eventually led me to law school. And when I got to law school, it was an interesting group of people. They were all smarter than I was. But when I got there, I found out that most of us grew up in the 60s and 70s and were influenced by people like Martin Luther King and by JFK. And some of the values that were instilled in us growing up were service to others. We learned to put country and others before ourselves. We learned that it's important for all people to have equality and justice, because if it isn't there for everybody, it won't be there for us. And so when I got out of law school, I thought that I wanted to do great things. When we were in law school, we didn't think we could change the world, but we thought we could make it a better place, and we thought we could make it a better place by helping people. And so there were lots of us in law school at the time who went out into the world with the idea that we could make a positive impact on the world. And certainly in the neighborhoods where we lived, we could make a direct impact. And so I wasn't a year out of law school. My first job, it was a miracle that I got into law school, a little bit of a miracle that I got out of law school, and a big miracle that I passed the bar exam. So I've been always grateful for that. But when I took my first job, it was in Bismarck, and I was less than a year out of law school when what happened to me is something that hasn't probably happened to any other lawyer in North Dakota, is that landing in my lap was the ARC case. And the ARC case was called the most significant litigation that the state of North Dakota had been involved in its history. And I was 6 months out of law school. And when the case landed in my lap, I wasn't sure what it was. I wasn't sure how big it was, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. But what the case was about, it was a class action on behalf of children and adults with developmental disabilities. The defendants in the case we started with the governor, and we sued the governor, the lieutenant governor, and 14 state officials who were charged with responsibility of providing programs and services to people with disabilities. The plaintiffs, my clients, were the thousands of people with developmental disabilities in the state of North Dakota. And at the time, they weren't being treated fairly. They were considered second-class citizens. They were shuttled off to an institution that was located at Grafton, where they were largely forgotten. The case itself was a top news story in the state for several years during the 80s. There aren't very many cases that last 16 years, but the first 16 years of my career I got to spend, it was a blessing for me to be able to spend my time and my energy working on behalf of people with disabilities. A little bit of background, I could tell you about the institution. I could tell you stories that would last for hours. The institution, by any measure, was a horrible place to live. And the treatment that went on for people with disabilities is treatment we should all be embarrassed about. The story itself is the legislature in North Dakota failed to adequately fund programs and services for people with disabilities. The result of that is that folks that we sent to the institution in Grafton, which was the only treatment program available, we sent them there and they were forced to live in inhumane conditions. The conditions were just awful. The following list is what the judge listed in his order. His findings were it had a substandard physical facility, inadequate numbers of staff, all of the things that you would expect at a school for people with disabilities. These are children and adults who were sent there for an education. They were sent there for training, and here's what they got. There weren't enough staff people to run the programs. A complete lack of privacy, and we'll take a look at some pictures just briefly. The lack of choice, and you think about all the choices you make every day. What time am I going to get up? What am I going to do today? What should I wear today? Who should I hang out with today? All of those choices were denied to the people who were there. Common clothes, and I'll talk about that here shortly. Loss of freedom of association. We think about how important our friendships are, how important our relationships are to all of us. All of these things were being denied to the people with disabilities they went to the state of North Dakota to ask for help. Physical and chemical restraint were common. People were shackled. They were tied to any object that wouldn't move because they didn't have enough staff. And they were medicated so that they would be easier to manage, and they were medicated mostly for the convenience of staff. Abuse and neglect was very common. There was a lack of medical care, lack of education. The death rate at the institution was 3 times the national average for similar institutions. They described it, that is, the state of North Dakota officials described it as a human warehouse. When we start looking at the facility itself, the buildings were old, they were overcrowded. It had more than 3.5 times the number of people who were supposed to be there. There were 1,300 people, individuals, who lived there when we got there. Anybody want to guess what that is? That white thing right over there?
Fire escape.
It's the fire escape. Any idea what that might have looked like? It was a slide on the inside. And you think about the idea that there's about 360 people living in this building, and if there's a fire, these are all people with cognitive impairments, and if there's a fire, they have to go to the fire escape. You would have to, they had 2 staff people on duty at night. You would have to get these 300 people into this circular slide and slide them down. And you would do that with 2 staff while the building was on fire. And it, of course, didn't meet fire code, didn't meet any kind of standards, but when you look at that, you'd say, well, that's not a very good setup, and then you'd look at it a little closer, and the tower, the silo, was locked on the outside with a padlock. So had the people been able to get into the fire escape, they wouldn't have been able to get out of the fire. And so it didn't meet fire standards. The state of North Dakota looked the other way while all of this was going on. We look at the bedrooms. Here, the bedrooms, you can tell that they're overcrowded. They would put a bed anywhere where they could. The people were housed. I come from a large family. I had 4 brothers. One of them snored. It was hard to get a good night of sleep. You think of putting 30 people in the same room, and you think about the level of disease that's transmitted among them. It's just very unsafe and unsanitary. Here's a picture of the bathrooms. People were left on the stools because they didn't have enough staff. They would bring them in on a schedule and leave them there and come back and pick them up in 15 minutes. Community clothing, and this is how we treated people with disabilities because we believe them to be lesser people. The community clothing, again, I come from a large family. I didn't mind sharing shirts and sweaters with my brothers. I probably would have even shared pants, maybe shoes, but when it comes to sharing underwear with my brothers, I probably wouldn't have done that. These folks had community clothing because they weren't considered individuals. They had a box, a closet here with you have sizes, and somebody goes in and picks out your clothes for that day. Again, indicative of they didn't consider people to be real people. We had inadequate adaptive equipment because they didn't have staff. The equipment that folks were given did more harm than good. I talked earlier about shackles and restraints. Here are some of the shackles that were used on people. Here's a restraint where they tied her to the bed to make sure she didn't wander. And when you look at that, the cumulative effect of that is that the people who were sent there were largely ignored and forgotten. It's a chapter of North Dakota history that should be embarrassing to all of us, the way we treated people because we considered them to be second-class citizens. The residents were ignored and forgotten. Abuse and neglect were rampant. Interestingly, when you went to Grafton, the superintendent became your legal guardian, and the superintendent sold people for drug research, and they were sold for behavioral research. And that was all to balance the budget. Forced sterilization was common. Again, strangely enough, it was permitted by law. And so if you went there, chances are you were sterilized. The lack of education and training perpetuated the status quo, and by that I mean that once you went there, there was no way out. You went there for an education but never graduated. When people went there, they were left there, and they were largely forgotten. According to the assistant superintendent, the only way that people left was in a pine box, and that's when they died. And so that's the care and the treatment that we provided to people with disabilities here in North Dakota. For 16 years, we fought with the state of North Dakota for equal rights and justice for people with disabilities. And we did that on a faith-based basis. The results of our case is we won. It took us 16 years to drag the state of North Dakota into the 20th century. The case was litigated, the state appealed, we fought more, the state appealed, and it was faith that kept us going through the whole thing for 16 years, knowing that the people we were helping, the least of these, my brethren, were my clients, and it was just a rare privilege to be able to be a part of that. The institutional population, when we got there, was 1,300 people. It has now been reduced to about 85 folks, and they're planning to close the institution, which will be a great relief to all of us who are disability advocates. 3,000 people across the state of North Dakota are provided with community-based services as a direct result of the court order. They're integrated into the community. They're meaningful participants in our social fabric, which is dramatically different than it used to be. The children are provided with real education. Adults are provided with real training, and most of it is job-related training. And so we have people who are holding down jobs and paying taxes, where before they were completely dependent on the state of North Dakota for their care. The facilities have to meet vigorous standards, so we know we're providing quality programs. North Dakota was the worst of the worst, according to the statistics and how we treat people with disabilities. We are now among the best, all as a result of the court order. Most of the folks who are at Grafton are now in their own apartments, holding down jobs, participating in life, where they were denied that opportunity before. The treatment program has been so great, it's been extended to other disability groups and to other states, where North Dakota is now held up as one of the top in the nation. If you're interested in seeing how some of the folks who were at Grafton are doing today, go to the prairiepublic.org website and click on I Am a Person. They recently did a documentary following up on these folks 20 years later, and how life is so much richer and better for them that it's unimaginable. And those of us who come from a faith base look at that and say, it has been my privilege to be a part of that. When we're commanded in Matthew that truly I say to you, whatever you did for the least of these, you do for me, it is a privilege to be a part of this and to be involved in making life better and making life richer for people with disabilities. It's just something that you can't explain. It's a fulfillment of a dream to be just a part of that. And when you look at faith in action, it isn't only me helping people with disabilities. There are other lawyers who are dedicated to helping people who are poor and homeless. The State Bar Association has a program where we provide free legal services to people in need. Hundreds of people benefit from that. There's a second program where they provide reduced fee services. The need is great. There aren't enough lawyers to go around to meet the need, but we're trying. And there are hundreds of lawyers each and every year who help people who are disadvantaged and oppressed. We do all kinds of work to serve others. We do that through community service. We do that through our legal service. And when you look at the scope of things that lawyers do, you look back at Micah and you say, lawyers as a group, I am proud to say, most of us attempt very diligently, day in and day out, to do justice. We try also to love kindness. That's hard to believe when I'm talking about lawyers, but we do. And the hardest thing, I think, for lawyers is to walk humbly, but we also try to do that as well. So next off, we've got Mark, who's going to talk about defending the accused and how he applies his faith in that effort.
Good afternoon. I share Mike's appreciation for the invitation to speak with you today. As Mike was speaking, I'm confident that very few of you, if any of you, thought, how on earth could you challenge the government? How on earth could you spend 16 years contesting what the government has done to these people? In fact, I'm guessing that the impression that most of you had was, we're fortunate that people like Mike and his colleagues will bring these cases and bring up injustices and seek justice. But I'm equally confident, in fact, probably a bit more confident, that nobody was thinking while Mike was speaking, how could lawyers defend the state of North Dakota, the superintendent, the governor? How could they drag that out for 16 years while Mike and his colleagues were pursuing that case? They weren't justifying the righteous position. They weren't doing God's work. How could they continue to argue? I'm sure that none of you thought that, but if I were to tell you or ask you to think about the lawyer for Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Jeffrey Dahmer, or pick any criminal that comes to mind, your view is oftentimes, how is it that this lawyer can represent that individual. I work in a law firm surrounded by lawyers who represent sometimes unseemly businesses, unseemly people, but folks often ask me, how can you as a criminal defense lawyer do those types of things? How can you represent a guilty person? And Mike is right, it's oftentimes difficult to be, for lawyers to be humble, but I can tell you as a criminal defense lawyer, you have to be, because the truth is this: the vast majority of the clients that I represent are factually guilty of something, and they likely committed what they are accused of doing. My role, however, though, is not to determine their moral guilt, their moral blameworthiness, but instead my role as a criminal defense attorney is to ensure that that individual is entitled to the procedural protections that our Constitution provides, and to make sure that that individual has a fair trial, that that person's rights have not been trampled by the government, much like Mike did as a private practice lawyer in challenging the governmental action in the ARC case. That's my role. I think it's interesting that, and oftentimes the question of how can you defend a guilty person is framed in the concept of, or context of, what we as lawyers call the ethical trilemma. And I would suggest to you that criminal defense lawyers, my colleagues, those that I work with closely, are as ethical, or in many instances more ethical, than their prosecution counterparts. But we as lawyers have ethical obligations to multiple entities, and we call this the trilemma. First and foremost, we have an ethical obligation to our client, and we are obligated to zealously represent the interests of that client. We also have an obligation to the legal system, to the court. If I appear in Judge Erickson's court, I have an ethical obligation, and as well as a moral obligation, to be truthful, to not mislead the court, to not mislead a jury. And that surprises a lot of lay people, that a criminal defense attorney has to be honest. Now, I don't know, I guess my view of how this works changed dramatically after I went to law school, because as my background was laid out to you, I spent 24 years in the military. I spent almost 6 years as a police officer. My intent in going to law school was to become a prosecutor. But I happened to run into one of the most ethical lawyers, one of the most ethical people that I've come to know, and I learned a lot about what contributions an individual can make by being a defense attorney, by helping somebody who is exceedingly oppressed. So the competing interest to the client, to the legal system, and then in many instances to the lawyer's own interests as well, creates kind of this ethical trilemma. And the way that I deal with that is I like to look at my role as being most importantly focused on representing the interests of my client, to be a zealous advocate. Justice, they say, is something much larger than, and perhaps even more intimate than truth. Truth is one of the ingredients of justice. We often hear that trials are a search for the truth. I would suggest to you that that sounds great, but it's not true. Judges oftentimes exclude evidence because it's too dangerous, it's too prejudicial. Lawyers try to, in the criminal context, we try to suppress evidence that was obtained illegally. If juries heard the entire truth, their function, they would be so biased, they would be so animated, they would be so upset that they would convict just because the people that we represent are bad people, rather than because the evidence is sufficient to find them guilty. In America, we have an adversarial system of justice. So like the ARC case where Mike represented the plaintiffs and a group of lawyers represented the defendants, each had advocates. I would suggest to you that nobody needs an advocate more than a singular person charged with a crime. Why? Because the government has massive resources. They have unlimited budgets, despite what you might hear. And I would suggest to you that when an individual's life and liberty is at stake, they need an advocate who does not have competing interests. As a result, criminal lawyers have a tendency to view their role differently. We see ourselves as a little bit more autonomous than other lawyers. But that doesn't change our faith. In fact, I've spent time praying with my clients. I spend time on my own praying for my clients. I hope that my clients pray for me too, and I look for wisdom and I seek wisdom. But the reality is this: there's a difference between moral guilt, legal guilt, and factual guilt. So if I represent a guilty client, I don't think that that competes with my Christianity. My role is not to determine my client's moral guilt. My role is not to determine my client's factual guilt. That will ultimately be left to a jury if they go to a jury trial. My role is to make sure that if that client is going to be convicted, that the government has met its burden of proof, that the evidence that the government has obtained was obtained lawfully rather than through coercion or threat or force or a violation of the rights that we hold sacred. And I get asked that question. I'm often asked, how can you represent a guilty person? And I tell people it's pretty easy. It's actually quite easy. And it's easier for me to represent somebody who comes into my office and says, Mark, I've done this. I need help. Let's move forward. That's easy. Honest clients, I then focus on the government's evidence. I focus on weaknesses on the case. I explain to my client how the trial process works. And in many cases, I help my client secure a fair result. That might result in my client pleading guilty. That might result in a trial where they're acquitted. That might result in a trial where they're convicted. But fair outcomes are what I seek as a criminal defense attorney. I advocate on behalf of my clients. I get asked often, too, by some of my former police colleagues, how is it that you can represent these people that you used to arrest and put in jail? I do a lot of drunk driving defense. I've been asked, how is it that you can represent somebody who creates such a danger? And there are groups that advocate against these things for good reason. But I would suggest to you, a commentator once told me, he said, you know, as a criminal defense lawyer, I've put more people in treatment than Mad Mothers as a group has put in treatment. One of the first things that I'll do with my clients when they come in with a domestic assault charge or with a drunken driving charge or picket, a drug charge, get an assessment, reach out, get help. Those things oftentimes help resolve the case favorably. But I view my role as not just necessarily standing up in court and making arguments, but it's a personal and spiritual journey for me to be able to help people get fixed. I tried to come up with one example, and I promised Mike that I would be quick because I, like Mike, prefer to hear Judge Erickson speak over myself. But I tried to come up with a biblical example to answer the question that Mike asked me to present to you and to discuss, and that is, how can you represent a guilty criminal? And I think if we look to the Bible for an example of that, some would cite Jesus, and it's not even fair to make a comparison between a defense lawyer and Jesus. But Jesus was called upon to judge a woman who was caught in the very act of adultery. We recall that from the Bible. At the time that occurred, it was a capital offense, punishable by death. And we all know what Jesus did. Jesus defended the woman, successfully, in fact. He's got a better track record than I do, by the way. But Jesus defended the accused woman, who it appears was factually guilty of what she was charged with or what she was accused of doing. Now, a Christian attorney may, in appropriate conditions, minister to the spiritual needs and struggles of his or her client, much like Jesus did with the adulterous woman. But in the adversarial design of our courtroom, the way our system is set up, an attorney has to emphasize and capitalize on the favorable evidence for his or her client. Now, as a defense attorney, I might point out that the investigation was not completed properly, that evidence was gathered unlawfully, just as the defense attorneys in Mike's ARC case argued that what we were doing as a state was appropriate. A Christian lawyer, I would suggest to you, whether it's a criminal defense lawyer, whether it's a prosecutor, whether it's a personal injury attorney, a criminal defense lawyer or a Christian lawyer is a peacemaker. And contrary to what a lot of people think, that's what I do, is I try to help my clients build peace, and my ultimate goal is to make sure that they're never back in the situation that caused them to come to my office in the first instance. I did want to be a prosecutor. I cannot express deeply enough how thankful I am that I found my way to the position that I'm in. I've helped a lot of people get through treatment. I've helped them through very difficult times. I've sat across the table from them in my office after a very bad event has changed their lives. The majority of the people that I represent are good people who've made a singular mistake because I do private practice work. My colleagues who do the bulk of their work is appointed do not necessarily have as good of clients as I do, but from time to time I have people that are struggling as well. But the best way that I can explain it to you is becoming a criminal defense lawyer has been a very humanizing process for me, and one that has allowed me to expand my faith and to reach my faith in the performance of my duties. All right. Was I close, Mike?
Very good.
Good afternoon. I'm not that entertaining. And I'm really amazed. I'm in very few rooms where I see so many friendly faces. And so it's good to be here. And it's good that you're here. And I don't believe you have any idea of how unusual a conversation this is that we're having here today. Part of it is that historically, judges don't talk about what they think or feel outside of the courtroom. And in our particular culture, judges and lawyers do not ordinarily talk about their faith, all right? They may express their personal opinions in small groups amongst their friends and family, the people they feel comfortable with at their churches or their synagogues. But the reality of it is that we don't have this conversation in public very often. There are a couple of things that I'd want to start with. If you're unhappy with the law, and you're unhappy the way the law is, you need to bear in mind that the law is organic. The law arises out of a culture. In the times when our culture was more religious, when it was much more Christian than it is today, there was a different kind of conversation that took place in the courtrooms and in the land. And lawyers were different because the law arises out of the culture. As our culture has become what some people describe as a post-Christian culture in the United States, our law has become more secular, and the conversations are more secularized. And people are much more reluctant to share what they really think or feel. And I think that's a great disservice to our society. And so I'm here. All around the country, when judges have chosen to speak about their faith, they have found themselves held up to some scrutiny. I'm not personally worried about that. What I want to tell you, though, is that as a society, we have to embrace faith. All right? And we need to allow people of all faiths and those without faiths to express their viewpoints without fear of contradiction or retribution. I have never met a person who does not have a philosophy or a theology. Never. But a high percentage of the people I know are unable to put into words the philosophy or theology that they hold. They couldn't begin to tell you what it is that they believe. They couldn't begin to tell you what it is that motivates them in their day-to-day life. And in a room this size, there's more than a couple of you who have not thought about this much in your lifetime. And my task that I would assign to you is to go home and think about what it is that you really believe, why you believe it. All right? Here's kind of where I'm at in my own life, in my own faith journey. There is a God, and I'm not it. All right? Now, you know, that's not earth-shattering, right? But you have to start with something, right? I believe I am a created being, and I believe that as a created being, I have an obligation to the Creator. I believe in a God who possesses entirely and perfectly any attribute that God possesses. So we live in a culture that is frequently prone to say God is love. That is true. But God is justice, and He is holy justice. God is truth. He is holy truth. God is wisdom. God is holy wisdom. God is compassion, and He is wholly compassionate. God holds all of these things in absolute perfection. He calls me to reflect that perfection to the best of my abilities in my day-to-day life in everything I do. I fall short of the mark nearly always. If I say these things, I hold myself out for ridicule and to be accused of being a hypocrite, because you could follow me around all day long and you could point out, yeah, well, hey, Judge, Ralph, that is not what the master would do. That doesn't make it any less true as to what my calling is. The light of the world came into the world to enlighten us that we might reflect His light. He was, He is to come again. When He comes, all of us will account for who we are. Those of us who hold positions of authority will be held to greater account than those who are weak and powerless. When you accept the position to judge, you expose yourself to judgment. You expose yourself to judgment in a way that the average citizen does not. Why? Because, like all the kings of the world, I will be called to account. I will be asked to lay whatever crown I have attained in life at the foot of the Master and explain, how did I help His people? How did I lead His people? What did I do to save His people? Was I just? Was I merciful? Did I inspire hope? Did I give comfort where there was suffering? And in my courtroom every day, a mass of humanity parades by, struggling, broken people, people in pain, people who are suffering, people who lack wisdom and insight, people who are lost, people who don't know who they are, people who don't understand that they were created in the image of God, that they have a higher calling. And in this entire thing that goes on in my courtroom, because of the way that our system operates, even when I have an answer that is true, I can't share it. Right? You know, what ails the whole human soul is fairly apparent, right? I mean, if you think about it, to the extent that we're living the truth, our lives will be in greater order. When we have people whose lives are completely disordered, it's because they've lost the truth, right? And so, when I'm called upon to judge people, I have a conversation where I talk about what they can do to make their lives better, what they can do to improve their condition, what they can do to change their lives in a way that they can be happier, productive citizens. And I'm going to do that all in a way that doesn't reflect overtly my personal faith. I'm a little different than a lot of judges. I do, in fact, occasionally talk about spirituality. I frequently talk about my own journey in life. I share my failures and my shortcomings with people I sentence regularly, because I think that there's a moment that takes place at a sentencing hearing that is a moment that is holy. Right? Here's what I know about faith. We live in a culture where it says that judges need to leave their faith at the door. We live in a culture where judges are told that who they are in their life on Sunday or Saturday or Friday, whenever you worship, is whatever it is, and it's separate from what you do in your work. I'm going to tell you something. We as lawyers are very good at separating our lives in a way that can be almost schizophrenic. All right? Where we say, hey, you know, at work I'm this person, I do these things, the law requires it, I do it, I don't lose a lot of sleep over it. I do what the law requires and I go home. And when I'm home, I live a different life. I want to tell you something about just a moment in history that I think is worth thinking about. In the Weimar Republic in Germany, there were hundreds, thousands of judges. They were mostly articulate, urbane, well-educated men and a handful of women. German culture was the highest developed culture, one of the highest developed cultures in Western Europe. And as the nation descended into madness and darkness, judges and lawyers were confronted with a choice. The judges were left with the choice of whether or not you were going to go along. And there developed really three classes of people amongst the judges. There were judges who were true believers in National Socialism. They really believed the whole thing, the eugenics, the social Darwinism, the whole thing. They bought it all. For them, it was not a problem. There was a second class of judges. These judges looked around and they said, you know, this doesn't seem right. And I don't know that I believe in this. And to varying degrees, those judges in the second class cooperated with the Nazis. Some group of them passively, in a passive-aggressive manner, resisted Nazism. They took the bench. They chiseled away at the edges where they could. They found people to be non-Jewish when they were. They did things like that, and they signed death warrants for other people because, you know, if you just turned them all loose, they were coming for you next, right? Then there was a third class of judge. And they understood that you could not cooperate with that sort of moral evil. And that group of people divided into two classes, subclasses. One class resigned, went home, shut up, read their books, listened to the opera, maybe complained to their neighbors, but otherwise minded their own business and went into seclusion. And then there was a subclass that resigned, that spoke out, that worked actively in opposition to the injustice, and they ended up, along with a number of other believers, in concentration camps. And when the war ended, we prosecuted two classes of men. We prosecuted those who actively embraced Nazism, and we prosecuted those judges who claimed and were able to point to some evidence that they had chiseled on the edges, did their best. And you see, that's the line that all of us in the judiciary walk every day. Every day. No system of justice is perfect. No legal system is perfectly just. No set of laws can be justly applied in every set of circumstances. Every day, we are called upon to make compromises. Every day, those of us who judge do. We are the frog in the little boiling pot of water every day. And if you pay no attention to it, you're going to just slide off the edge at some point, right? And so the struggle that we have is to say, okay, where do you cross the line where it's necessary for you to say, I can't do that? It can't be done. All right? You have to accept as a given, if you decide to be a judge, that there's going to be a moment in time when you are absolutely certain that you are called upon to do something by the law that you do not believe in, that you do not believe is just, that you believe causes more harm than good. And if you quit the first time that happens, you're not going to be there more than 20 days. And so how do you deal with that? Well, early on, I came to the belief that, you have to be willing to accept little injustices at some level in order to work to accomplish greater good on the broader playing field. But you also have to be cognizant of when you're being asked to do something that you cannot in good faith do under any circumstance. So far, I have not reached the point where I've said, it is time for Ralph to go back to practicing law. But it could happen. It could happen tomorrow. It could happen a month from now. Or it might never happen. You don't know. People ask me, have you ever sentenced somebody to a sentence that you knew was, or that you really just didn't believe in? And my answer to that is almost every week. We live in a society where everybody decided to get tough on crime, and we decided that we were going to limit the authority of judges. And by doing that, we made it harder to be a judge, if you think, right? If you care. Now, there's a whole other class of judge that just says, hey, that's the law. I just follow it. Don't care. Not my problem. And the question you've got to ask yourself as you go about looking at judicial candidates, as you think about the law and how it plays out, is how do we discern who these men and women are and what they're going to bring to the table? And what I would just ask for you is to be a little charitable, right? The burden is not so heavy that you can't bear it. I mean, I don't want to leave the impression that somehow this is a great heavy burden I bear every single day, because it's not, as long as you understand who you are, what you can do, and at the end of the day, it's not it's like, there's something that John the 23rd used to say. He used to tell his valet when he was getting ready for bed, he would say at the close of his prayers, "You know, Lord, I'm going to bed now. It's your church anyway." And you know, that's kind of the approach I take to judging. You know, it's his court anyway. I do the best I can every day, and then I go home and I spend time with my family, and I go to basketball games and soccer games and, you know, whatever they're doing, and then I go to bed. And then I get up the next morning, we try again. Some days are harder than others, but it's a very rewarding life. You know, after all this is said and done, I would just say it's amazingly rewarding, because for the most part, the people I deal with care a lot. The lawyers are concerned, the people who work in the courts are concerned, the probation officers, law enforcement. You know, they're good people trying to do the best they can. You know, sometimes it doesn't work out that way, and sometimes it's pretty ugly. And when you pick up your paper, you might say, "What's wrong with those idiots?" And I just ask, like I said, be a little charitable, because, you know, a lot of those really bad decisions don't really look that bad when you make them, you know? I mean, you know, you get the best information you can, you make the call, and then you hope it turns out. And sometimes it's bad, you know? You have bad days, you have good days, you know? Every once in a while, I love this time of year because I get Christmas cards from people I've sentenced from time to time, right? And they'll say things like, "You changed my life, it's a really good thing." That's a good day. But, you know, there are bad days. There are days where you pick up the paper and you'll see that someone that you've dealt with has committed suicide or been killed in some kind of a criminal act. And you look at that and you'd say, that's a hard day. We lost that one, you know? And that's kind of the story. I think we do the best we can, and at the end, we have what we have. And I know I promised I'd give you 10 minutes for questions, and I went over a minute and a half. No, 2 minutes, sorry.
Thank you, Judge. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to entertain them. I think in each of us has a job, and it's always difficult balancing your faith and how do you integrate that into your activities of daily life. I think my job is pretty easy. I know Mark thinks his is easy. Judge Erickson has the toughest job in the world. And we've talked about how his faith influences his decisions. You can't say that in public, but we've talked about how that colors his character and decisions. And for all of us, it's an ongoing challenge that you meet day by day as best you can. Does anybody have any questions that we could answer? I know we've gone on long enough. That being said, thank you for inviting us here, and have a Merry Christmas.
Thank you for inspiring us and reminding us that even the law is a calling. And I hope that all of us see that about the careers we have chosen to carry out in life. Thank you so much for participating in this luncheon today and throughout the semester. And I wish every one of you a very Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays. Please be safe out there, and I will see you in January. And again, reminder, that's at the Avalon Center for the next luncheon on January the 24th. All right? Merry Christmas.